Caroline would normally be here. She is the president of the Historical Society. She would be the one to welcome you, but unfortunately she is out of town this evening, and she asked for someone to fill in, and you have me tonight. So before we really get started, I wanted to give you a quick update and a quick plug for our upcoming events. This Sunday on the 21st is our monthly tour day at the Mesier Homestead. We do tours in the afternoon there, so if you have not had a chance to visit yet, please come and take a tour of the homestead. It gives you a chance to learn a little bit more about local history. And now that you'll be so knowledgeable about the Browers and the Mesiers, and you come and visit their home, you'll be able to put that all in a little bit of context. On October 4th, which is a Saturday, we have our third annual Stones and Bones Living History program at the Wappingers Rural Cemetery. It is a fabulous event where costumed apparitions come to life and tell stories of their life in Wappinger. It was a sold-out event. We just, the other day, added just a couple of slots for those nighttime dark tour programs. So if you're interested, please sign up on our website to get those last handful of tickets. And for our Historical Society members, we've arranged for a private tour for us at the Brickerhoff House in East Fishkill, courtesy of the East Fishkill Historical Society. So if you are a member, you'll receive an email in another week or so with the details about that, and that is a complimentary tour, one historical society to the other. And if you've missed it, there is a copy of our upcoming events out on the sign-in desk, and that goes through the holiday period, so it has information about our holiday open houses. So, tonight's topic, Brower versus Mesier, and Mesier versus Brower, assault, slavery, and court crisis between the two founders of Wappinger in 1793. We are so pleased to once again have Dr. Will Tatum with us. He has served as Dutchess County historian since October of 2012. He holds a bachelor's in history from the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and a master's and PhD in history from Brown University. As Dutchess County historian, Dr. Tatum designs exhibits, conducts archival projects, and presents public programming, and I might add, lots of public programming and lots of different topics that he covers. And so we're very fortunate to have him here again with us this year. Thank you so much for coming. He coordinates the county's history community, which includes local historians, historical societies, preservation groups, and state and federal historic sites. We are very eager to hear about all of the feuds between those two founding families, between the Browers and the Mesiers. We might have some family connections here in the audience too. And so please help me welcome Dr. Tatum.
All right, good evening everyone. Thank you for joining us here on a Thursday night in September. I swear that it was much cooler this time last year. We've got a little bit of a respite. Just out of curiosity, before we get into the evening's festivities, has anyone heard of the term a cock and bull story? All right, keep that to yourself. This is going to be a learning experience for everyone. So our images up here, as you can see, one is from an angle on, and I remember now that the pointer doesn't work on TVs. One of these is the back angle of what we now know today is the Mesier Homestead. And it's taken from this angle because the smaller building, which has been under restoration for the past couple of years, is actually probably the home of Nicholas Brower, and the first home that Peter Mesier would have occupied on the site before building the much more lavish Mesier house that we all know from the front of the modern site. And that's what brings these two families together. And on the other side there is the back side of one of the documents that we're going to be talking about today. So this is where our story begins. This is a document from our court collections, which run from 1721 through to 1889. And it's something that I ran across when I was preparing last year's presentation, which was looking at revolutionary shopping and thinking about, all right, Peter Mesier was here as a storekeeper. What sort of things might be kept in his store? This one stood out to me, though, because it is a recognizance for an enslaved person, a man named Jack who was enslaved by Peter Mesier. And this is post-Revolutionary War. It's dated November 15th, 1793. That's interesting because if you sort of tune in every now and again to the generalities of history of slavery, of the history and experience of the enslaved people, one of the things that is often brought up is that this idea enslaved people never appear in court because their testimony is not trusted, they're not seen as human beings, etc., etc. That is not the case here in Dutchess County because they do appear in court every now and again. And when I see them, I try to follow up, which is how we get to tonight's story. So what do we learn from Jack's recognizance? The first thing that we need to cover is, what is a recognizance? English common law has a bunch of crazy terms that descend from the Middle Ages, when court was a thing that either happened when a manor lord, a bishop, or a king or queen was around, and then obviously over time became a more modern institution. We here in New York, our state law system is more or less English common law, only marginally adjusted over time. So you see these terms being used well past the era of the American Revolution, whereas in other places you would not see them used solely. A recognizance is a bail bond. Basically, it says you come to a justice of the peace, normally because you've been summoned. It's not something you necessarily do voluntarily. Because you have two choices in 18th century Dutchess County if you are summoned to appear before court. Choice number one, you go to a justice of the peace and you swear that you will show up, and if you don't show up, you will pay a fine, or someone called a surety will pay a fine for you. The other option is you get to stay in jail until the next court session. So this is November of 1793. The next court session is going to be in January of 1794. And that's actually an advance because originally the Dutchess County courts met twice a year instead of 3 times a year. So if you were confined between the October and the May courts, you would spend that time in jail if you did not have a recognizance sworn out. And the jail at that point in time, and really up until a surprisingly recent date, the early 20th century, the 1920s, the jail was in the basement of the Dutchess County Courthouse. Which, if you've ever seen that building, the building today is number 5, and we want to keep it that way because it's a beautiful structure completed in 1902. That sits on the side of every previous Dutchess County courthouse, and all of them have had the jail cells inside of it. So what else do we learn from this? That surety thing. So Peter Mesier, who is the enslaver of Jack, stands surety, says, I will pay 20 pounds if Jack does not show up to the next meeting of the Court of General Sessions. So what is the Court of General Sessions? Now you can see that there's some additional vocab education here tonight. You have 2 courts in Dutchess County now, just like you had 2 courts then. One is the criminal court, the other is the civil court. Up until 1889, the criminal court is the Court of General Sessions. The civil court is the Court of Common Pleas. So when you're summoned to appear before General Sessions, this is not what we normally talk about in these sorts of presentations where person A has loaned person B money and person B kind of forgot to repay the money and ignored all of the reminders, so now person A is taken to court to get an order to give money back. That's common pleas. General Sessions means in this era you have made an offense against the people of the state of New York. This is serious stuff. So Jack's going to have to go up to Poughkeepsie. He's going to have to appear on January the 21st, 1794. But because Peter Mesier is standing surety for him, he can stay at home. He does not have to go sleep in an unheated jail cell where you actually have to pay rent. Yes, because the County of Dutchess and the state of New York, in contrast to today, they're not going to give you bedding, so no blankets, no mattresses. They're not going to give you food or water. They're not even going to give you medical treatment if you get sick because it's like January or December of 1793. You've been down in the cold, unheated cellar of the county courthouse for a while. All of that comes out of your own pocket. You have to pay for the pleasure of being halfway decently incarcerated in 1797. And then finally, why is Jack being summoned to court? Because he has made Nicholas Brower fear for his life. That's the other beautiful thing about these recognizances. They tell us all of this information. Finally, at the very end of the document, they tell us what the offense is. So that's pretty interesting. Nicholas Brower is a white man standing in the community. We know that there's a relationship between the Brower and the Mesier families that is united by land title. And suddenly we have the enslaved person of the Mesiers causing Nicholas Brower to fear for his life. That seems like something worth looking into. But wait, there's more. Because this was not the only recognizance that was sworn out on November 15, 1793. Our second one, this one here, concerned Peter Mesier himself. So he appears before the same Justice of the Peace. This is Henry Livingston Jr., potentially the author of The Night Before Christmas. That is one of the two possible explanations for it. So he's appearing before the same guy, the same Justice of the Peace, on the same day, and he has brought his son Matthew with him to stand surety. So Matthew is going to swear that if his dad doesn't show up, he'll pay 10 pounds, because at this point in time, we are right at that dividing line between moving from pound sterling to United States dollars. And then, of course, Peter is going to pay a fine of 20 pounds if he doesn't show up. Where do they have to show up? Yes, the Court of General Sessions on January 21st, 1794. And what is the charge this time? Making Nicholas Brewer fear for his life. So now we have both the master and the enslaved person doing something, not specified, that's making Nicholas Brower fear for his safety. Now, what could possibly be next? Could there be another recognizance? Yeah, there's a third recognizance. Any guesses on who this one is for? You guys are a little early with your timing, but we'll get to that. No, this one is from Matthew Mesier. So you've got the dad, you've got the enslaved person, and now you've got the son, same day, all appearing before the same Justice of the Peace. Guess who's going to stand surety for each other? The father and the son, again. But in this case, Peter is promising to pay a fine of 15 pounds. And Matthew is promising to pay the largest fine of all, 30 pounds. This is a significant amount of money. This is more than a common laborer earns, like someone who is working to plant and then harvest crops. This is more than they're earning in multiple years. So this is like, the court really wants these guys to show up. And what has Matthew Mesier done? He's beat, wounded, and ill-treated Nicholas Brower to the endangering of his life. So the impression that we get from these first three recognizances is that something happened where Peter Mesier, his son Matthew Mesier, and the enslaved person Jack all somehow ganged up and assaulted Nicholas Brower. Okay, that is concerning, but what is more concerning still, there couldn't possibly be a fourth recognizance. Could you guys probably think I'm bluffing, but maybe not, because you did provide a great answer earlier. We have this recognizance here, which is indeed for Nicholas Brower. So how does the guy who's supposedly being assaulted end up also being required to show up in court? Well, one of the fine points of prosecuting a crime in really pre-1850s America, at least in the areas that have the English law-based system, is that witnesses have to show up. If you have someone charged with a crime, even a criminal crime, and no witnesses show up to testify against them, then the state is kind of at a loss. It's hard to convince a jury when the only people that you have available to you are the defendants. They probably aren't going to out themselves. So sometimes you see recognizances, and the verb associated with this, which I'll use later on, is bound over. You see people bound over to appear as witnesses at their own trials, because maybe Nicholas Brower was beaten so badly, he's afraid to show up because that might lead to further violence. This is a possibility. And we see when we look at this is a physically different document from the others. You've got a nice long page, you've got all this stuff up front, and you've got the stuff on the bottom. So now we're going to get a little bit into the process. What do we see when we look at those squiggles up close? The top part of this, as the date November 18, 1793, says, warrant returned by Joseph Green, Constable, issued by Henry Livingston, Esquire. And then below that we have November 14th, commanding the constable to bring Nicholas Brower before any justice of the peace in said county to give sufficient surety for his personal appearance at the next general sessions. All right. So how does this whole recognizance thing work? To make sure that you show up, to basically fill out a bail bond, a justice of the peace will issue an order to a constable to go find you, because it's not always easy to find people in 18th century Dutchess County, even post-Rev War. And they're going to bring you physically before the justice of the peace to do one of those two things. Either you are going to bring a surety with you and swear that you'll be good and show up in court, or the constable will be charged with carrying you physically up to Poughkeepsie to deposit you in the basement jail of the courthouse. So we see that whole process lined up here, which seems kind of extreme since we can presume that was done for the Mesiers, but we don't have any actual proof of it. However, when we look down at the bottom of this, we see some interesting things. So first of all, he's not being brought before Henry Livingston Jr. He's being brought before a different justice of the peace. That's a little unusual if he's being bound over as a witness. Secondly, you've got two people. You've got a Nicholas Brower, who was identified in this recognizance as a miller. We know the Browers were millers. He stands surety for himself for 30 pounds. Again, a lot of money. This is the same amount of money that Matthew Mesier, who's identified as having physically beaten Nicholas Brower so badly that they feared for his life. And then his son, who pledges with him, pledges 15 pounds. So this is almost a reflection of the same level of commitment that we see between Peter Mesier and Matthew. Father and son stuff. Nicholas Sr. must appear at his next general session, so same time that the Mesiers are supposed to appear, January 21st, 1794, to answer such misdemeanors as shall be objected to him by Peter Mesier, and the rest of that on the said peoples of the state of New York's behalf, and shall in the meantime keep the peace towards the said Peter Mesier and the people of this said state, suggested Nicholas Brower has also been doing something bad. Even though we don't get the specificity as an assault, as some other sort of threatening behavior, we just get the sort of interesting but ultimately unsatisfying misdemeanor. It's not a felony, but it's still bad enough to have to go before general sessions. So just to recap, for those of you who might be a little lost in the sea of recognizances, November 1793 is a very busy time. We have Peter Mesier, his son Matthew, and their enslaved person Jack being called in and bound over to appear at the January 1794 General Sessions, the criminal court, to answer for an assault on Nicholas Brower. But at the same time, Nicholas Brower has to swear out a recognizance that he will also appear at the same court session in order to answer a misdemeanor charge of undisclosed nature from Peter Mesier. So it's one of those things where they're both pointing at each other, but they've managed to get two different justices of the peace interested, and they're being required to go up to Poughkeepsie or else. Because not only do you have to pay the fine if you fail to show up, then they will physically fine you and confine you in the jail. Not a fun experience, not right. So my question is, what is in the Wappingers water supply that is creating all of this violence? So let us turn the clock in a slightly different direction. How do we know any of this stuff? That was one of the questions that Supervisor Catasini asked me, and the answer to that is our Ancient Documents Project. So this started, believe it or not, almost 13 years ago when I entered service as your county historian, because we happen to have a collection called the Dutchess County Ancient Documents. It is all of the court filings from those two courts, the criminal court and the civil court, from 1721 to 1889. We estimate around 400,000 pages of material. It is the largest and the most complete collection of its kind for a county court in the state of New York. So that is to say, our neighbors across the river in Ulster County have records that are older because they were part of the Dutch colony of New York. So they have literally court filings in Dutch, but they're not as complete as ours is. Some of the western counties have more complete records, but they're a lot younger than ours are. So we are that sweet spot, which is why for the past 13 years, we've been digitizing them. We have actually applied for and received our 12th year of funding because of COVID. 1 year became 2 years on one of those. But we've so far, as you can see, received $277,000 of grant funding from the state of New York to do this work, and we have made it all available online so far at 212,000 pages of material. We are currently working in the 1830s. So, what does that translate for all of you? Because I know you're going to take careful note of every document number. You're going to rush home. You're going to go to that URL. You're going to say, I want to see this stuff for myself, make sure he's not lying. Because that's always my approach to other historians. If you click on that URL, you will go to our beautiful Ancient Documents Search Portal interface designed by our Dutchess County Office of Central Information Services. And if you pop in just the document number, like that one that I just showed, so this is the one on the side here, it will pop up. You'll get a nice fluorescent link there on the left, and you click on that. Full color, high resolution image pops up for free. You can save that, you can do whatever you want with it because it is made available through taxpayer funds. And one of the ways that we can see, all right, Peter Mesier, Nicholas Brower, these guys, like, are they familiar with the court, or is this their first time here? Well, we can do a search. For example, Peter Mesier. And for those of you who, like me, can't really read this stuff from a distance, you see that Peter Mesier turns up a whole bunch. He is in court a lot. All right, that's fine, you know, that's cool. How about Nicholas Brower? We'll search for him. Yes, he's also there from an even earlier date. So this tells us these guys are no strangers to the legal system, which is probably why they are basically countercharging each other with high crimes or high-ish crimes against the people of the state of New York. Bold strategy, not recommended if anyone is taking notes for current family feuds. So when we get below on this, we're going to pause for a second and consider what was life like in colonial and early Republic Dutchess, because things do start to take off in the 1790s, but we're right on the cusp of that. So as you can see with this nice blob of a map here, we start off as huge land patents. We don't have towns until 1788. Those land patents gradually become colonial precincts, which are the British colonial equivalent to a town. The one we are standing in right now is Rondout Precinct. So that's the one, the sort of weird triangle with Wappinger Creek at the top that you can see in the lower left there. We're founded in 1683, very slow growth, which the Browers are part of. We'll get to that a little bit later. It's really a tenant farmer experience here in Dutchess County, because how you make this land profitable is you grow wheat on it, which is a great idea right up until the point when the Erie Canal opens and wheat prices go through the floor. Very much the wrong direction. But of course that means that you have to have mills to grind this wheat into flour, because you're not shipping wheat sheaves down to New York City to make your money. You're shipping barrels of flour, which will also pop up later. Water is your primary form of transport, which is why we are again in one of the earliest settled parts of Dutchess County, because if you can get to it by boat, that's attractive. If you have to go by road, terrible idea. Like pretty much a terrible idea until the 1820s. And it's considered thinly populated, backwards on the eve of the Revolution. It's starting to pick up by the 1790s, because by this point, all of those British imperial trade regulations, which were really brakes on the experience of the economy here in Dutchess, are off, and you're growing great guns in terms of loss of economic activity. You now have roads that are worth traveling on, and the Brouwers and the Mesiers are both benefiting from this. So let's again recap the standard story of Peter Mesier as we all know it and love it. This is regularly told. So first, he was a Tory living in New York City, but in 1777, he comes up to Wappinger. He's going to settle up here because the British have invaded New York. But if you're a Tory, wouldn't you actually stay where the British army was? It's the first little hole in all of this. So secondly, it said he purchased what would become the Mesier Homestead from Nicholas Brouwer. That is sort of semi-correct. And finally, Mesier's high prices led to the Wappingers' Tea Party. Folks got tired of this stuff. They broke into his shop and stole all the tea, which is great until you realize that it's 1777 when he moves up here, and all the tea parties are kind of like a 1773, 74 experience. So, what does the published history have to say? Before we get to crazy stuff like the ancient documents, this is Frank Hasbrook. You can find his 1909 History of Dutchess County, available online for free if you want to read on a computer screen. It's on archive.org. It is the most reliable full county history because telling 3 centuries of Dutchess County's experience, the entirety of the experience, that's a big lift. The last time we thought that was a good idea was in 1909 when Frank Hasbrook. He was a long-serving county judge, so he had a bunch of access to records, some of which that we no longer have access to today. So, he states the Mesiers are descended from French Huguenots. French name, yeah, that seems pretty clear. Mesier was a notorious Tory, made a lot of money off the British Army. Okay, that at least lines up with our standard understanding of the Mesiers. And then he moved to Rombout in 1777 and purchased what is today the Mesier Homestead plus some additional property from Nicholas Brouwer. 422 acres, technically, through an intermediary, Matthew Van Boonscher. So how does this all pan out? We'll get to that in a second because now we have to deal with the Brouwers. This is a family we didn't talk about last time. So the Brouwers. Frank Hasbrook says they're an old Dutch family. Okay, that kind of checks. Adolphus Brouwer's miller from Holland. He builds the Yellow Mills and Wappingers Falls in the 1750s. Because again, if you are raising wheat as your primary crop, you've got to have something to grind it down. And if you want to be an entrepreneur who makes a lot of money in 18th century Dutchess County, building a mill is a good idea. So he sets up shop here initially. When he dies, his brother Nicholas takes over and builds the Red Mill. All right, that's wonderful. Nicholas Brouwer also serves as a captain in the 2nd Dutchess County Militia during the Revolutionary War. Peter Mesier appears on no rolls for Dutchess County and the Revolutionary War. He seems to have skipped militia service, unless, of course, the documents just don't survive. Nicholas dies in 1787. His son, who is conveniently also named Nicholas, takes over all of the family's operations here in Wappinger. What do those operations include? A shipyard down on the Hudson that builds all sorts of vessels, gunboats for the War of 1812, and also a sloop that Matthew Mesier is going to use to transport flour down to New York City. So there's another interesting intersection. It's not just about the land that they own together, it's also about some interfacing through shared commercial ventures. All right. So now we've done the story of Peter Mesier and the Mesier Homestead as it's usually told. We've done what the published sources say about Peter Mesier and Nicholas Brouwer. Now what do the primary sources say? Well, with Peter Mesier, we have again from the ancient documents records that he's in Dutchess County as early as 1763. That's a full 14 years before 1777. It is at the very end of the French and Indian War, just before the imperial crisis begins, back when everyone still loves Great Britain. All right, it's interesting. Then, thanks to documents like this one, we know that he is identified as a merchant from New York City. That's good. but he's also doing a heck of a lot of legal business at the Dutchess County courts, normally going after people who owe him money, which is like 90% of the collection, not going to lie. He appears on the tax rolls, which means he is a resident, in 1777. So all right, that lines up with the story that we know, both from the retelling of it and from Frank Hasbrook's, and you can actually see him with the red line right there, but he's listed with Matthew Van Boomschoten. So that also seems to line up with what Frank Hasbrook is saying about the two of them being involved in land transfer. And then finally, by 1779, Peter has a farm up in Poughkeepsie in addition to his land here in Wappinger. So he is expanding his holdings. He's probably going to use the farm not only to provide for his own family's agricultural needs, but also more stuff to sell, either down to New York City or local. Now, we do know that even though he was not a Tory, it appears that his wife might have been, because the only solid document that we have from the Revolutionary era touching on Peter Mesier only mentions him because it's for his wife, Catherine Mesier. And she is warned to stay under house arrest, not to leave Dutchess County without written permission from the committees of safety, and to avoid contact with anyone going to or coming from New York City. So there is some, perhaps, basis for the idea that Peter Mesier might have Tory leanings, but it's not him, it's his wife. And yes, he did end up removing from New York City up to the Hudson Valley in 1777, in the spring of 1777. But that's not necessarily a sign that he's a Tory, because he's been doing stuff up here since 1763. And 1777 is basically here, especially in the spring, where the British Army, which holds New York City and Long Island, says to anyone who's not a loyal subject of the crown, if you want to leave, now's the time to go. Likewise, in the spring of 1777, all of the revolutionary authorities who control the rest of New York say, if you're not loyal to the revolution and you think the Union Jack is really the way to go, now might be the time for you to depart and go down to New York City. So these sorts of exchanges, not unusual at all. Now, what do we know from Nicholas Brower? By chance, is Sarah Brower here with us tonight?
She is not.
Okay, so Sarah Brower is a descendant of the Brower family. She came up from Philadelphia last fall, and she put me on to what you see a horrible image of. This is a really terrible scan of a document that we have, but this is the one that is off of FamilySearch.org. This is a land deed, and one of the things that we specialize in the county clerk's office, which the Department of History is part of, is land records. We go all the way back currently to roughly 1718 with this stuff. Now, in the colonial period, you were not required. In fact, even today, you are not required to record land transactions at the county clerk's office. Those of you as homeowners might be asking yourselves, why did I pay all of that money to the real estate attorney and to the title search company? Because it's still a really good idea to record your land title with the county clerk's office, because at any point in time, you, me, Christina can be challenged by someone who says, I have a better title to your land than you do. And that's why we have insurance for titles. But one of the weird things that we see with this stuff is deeds are sometimes recorded long after they are initially made out, and that is the case here. So, this deed, page 314 of Library 210, is dated, April 4th, 1777. It is not recorded in 1777. It is recorded in 1881. In fact, the entire title history for the Mesier holdings, including Mesier Homestead, that dates before 1881, was recorded in 1881. The family held on to all of the legal documents. But it's a good thing that this stuff was recorded in the county clerk's office in 1881. And this could be a future program, because the deed chain is so detailed, it more or less gives us a sort of written, spoken, but sadly not a drawn out map of what Wappingers looked like from about 1740 on up until 1787. So a lot of great early data there, but also a lot of family data on the Browers. It's amazing what you can learn from a deed document. So one of the things we learned is that this history of this piece of land goes all the way back to the Wrongbout Patent. The Wrongbout Patent was established legally in 1685. That's a long way back. This lot goes back to lot number 4, and it tells us where the Browers come from, because originally this belongs to William Skinner of Middlesex County, New Jersey. Why is a guy in New Jersey owning property in Dutchess County? Real estate speculation. That is, in fact, the whole driving force behind the settlement of Dutchess County in the 18th century. He sells this parcel to Adolph Brower, sometimes also recorded as Adolphus Brower, in 1741. It's approximately 700 acres of land. And Adolphus Brower at this time was a resident of Bergen County, New Jersey, which we also know from deed records. So Adolphus decides New Jersey's great and all, but the Hudson Valley is really where it's at. I've heard of this creek called Wappinger. I think I'll move up there. And then he proceeds to drive the development and settlement of Wappinger, because now you have a mill. That's hugely important for getting tenant farmers on. Next thing we learn, again, from a deed document. Do not take them for granted as being boring things. Adolphus dies intestate in 1742. So a year-ish after he buys this land. Okay, well, that's sad. The right of inheritance does not pass to his son, or his brother, as Frank Hasbrook has us believe. It passes to his son, Nicholas Brower. This is kind of an important generational point here. Nicholas purchased additional land from a guy named Lawrence, who is a real person. I'm not making that part of half the document. In 1761, and then finally in 1777, he sells the land to Matthew Van Boonschoten, who ends up being a comrade of his. So Nicholas Brower was a captain in the 2nd Regiment of Dutchess County Militia in 1775. Matthew Van Boonschoten is a lieutenant. They're both officers. They're both buddies. They can trust each other. This is great. Except, and the total lot size of this is 791 acres. And that's a lot of land. But what happens next will shock you. So, Van Boonschoten sells all of this 791 acres to Peter Mesier roughly a month later on May 1st, 1777. So why do we have this proxy arrangement? We've always assumed that this suggests some bad blood between the Browers and the Mesiers. We don't have any legal actions between the two of them or against each other that we've been able to find yet before 1777, but it's really weird for an intermediary to pay 3,000 pounds. That's like Jane Austen level money in 1777. That's a ridiculously high sum. And then turn around and be like, hey buddy, how about you give me the same amount back and this can all be yours. On the other hand, we also see that the next deed in here is William Brower, the son of Nicholas Brower. We know that Nicholas Brower Sr., because of this deed, he dies, we know, in 1787. His son, who's the executor of the state, sells a half interest in that shipyard, as well as some lots in Poughkeepsie, to Peter Mesier for 5 shillings. So, a very small amount of money, definitely not a arm's length or beyond transaction. However, this is all great and good. We've established that there's some wonderful history on the Browers. They go further back than the Mesiers. We have established when the actual handover from Brower to Mesier happens. We have also established that there's some sketchy stuff going on that we don't necessarily have enough records remaining about to get into the nitty-gritty yet. Research is ongoing. But now it's time to go back to the court. So it's January 1794. These are our general sessions minutes because we have, thankfully, both the minutes as well as the filings of these courts so that we can look through and see, okay, what happened here? So we look through January 21st, 1794. We see a list of people who have recognizances sworn out against them. So they've shown up. We've got Nicholas Brower at the top there. We have Peter Mesier and his son Matthew Mesier, and there's no mention of the enslaved person Jack. And on the side here, for those of you who can't read squiggly handwriting at a distance, it says, all right, these guys did not show up, so we will wait and see if they show up tomorrow. And then they proceed to go through the rest of their docket of all the other people who did show up who were bound over. And then we get, all right, recognizance of the peace, defendants appeared in discharge by proclamation. Brower is discharged. That means that the judges stand up and say, we don't think there's enough of a case against you, so all charges dismissed, go home, enjoy your life. It's a big win for Nicholas Brower. Which incidentally, this is 1793, and Nicholas Brower dies in 1787. I don't think this is zombified Nicholas Brower from the 1740s. Pretty sure this is his son, Nicholas Brower Jr., which is going to play somewhat of an important role eventually. The Mesiers, on the other hand, who now suddenly, in that record, Peter Mesier for Jack, his slave, just reading the quote there, they appear, and they're going to be bound over for the May 1794 term. For anyone who has had the unfortunate experience of being in court before, you know that it is not common, it is not uncommon to find out that your case is going to be held over for the next session. But I'm sure that they're just going to have to wait once for this, right? At the May Court of 1794, the Mesiers are bound over for the October Court. Now, the good news is, for them at least, those recognizances remain in force. So as long as they don't go assault Nicholas Brower again, as long as they don't assault anyone else, as long as they maintain peace, all they really have to do, which is still super inconvenient, is come up to Poughkeepsie for every court session, wave when their name is called, and sit there in the county courthouse until something's going to be done. There's going to be a trial, because these are jury trials at the general sessions. All right, May Court of 1794, what's going to happen? Mesiers are bound over for January of 1795. January 1795 court, I've got a good strong feeling about this. I'm sure that we are going to see the people versus the Mesiers on this one, except they're bound over for the May 1795 court. And at the May 1795 court, they're bound over for the October 1795 court. This is where dark humor comes in, because as a historian, reading through these proceedings, and you're like, maybe it'll be the next page, and then it's like, oh, it is the next page, but the next page says, see the next page. This couldn't possibly keep going on. Oh wait, October of 1795, they're bound over for the March 1796 court, because they decided January, now we're not going to meet. March 1796, this has got to be the one, right? No, they're bound over for October 1796. And this is supposed to be a serious criminal offense. A man was put in fear of his life. October of 1797, the Mesiers are still awaiting trial. In March of 1798, they no longer appear on the court's docket. So for those of you who don't know what a cock and bull story is, a cock and bull story is where you promise to tell a story, but you never quite get to the story itself. Instead, you talk all around it, because sometimes you see documents as a historian that get you really excited, and you are super sure that we're going to learn really cool stuff, like what did Matthew Mesier do to Nicholas Brower Jr.? How was an enslaved person involved in this? Was Peter Mesier like taking bets on the side? What was his experience with all of this? And this is the result when it comes time to actually deliver the program. They're there, they're waiting 4 years, and then finally they just don't show up anymore, because clearly the court's decided no witnesses are showing up to this. I guess we'll just forget it ever happened. However, as a consolation prize for all of you, in the process of doing this research, some other material came up about other court actions involving Peter Mesier versus Nicholas Brower that potentially can be the topic of some future discussions. But the biggest takeaway of all is that through these programs, we continue to push our knowledge and understanding of the history of Wappinger, specifically the area covered in Wappingers Falls today, and the iconic historic site of the Mesier Homestead. Further back, we are getting a better understanding for the lived experience of the people who created that site, and all of that is going to be invaluable as we head into Rev 250 next year. So with that, I will hesitantly ask for any questions, because the answer may be, I have no idea. This is called the silence of the archive. All right. Oh, we have one question.
Silly question.
Yes.
I always get hung up on Wappinger
Mm-hmm.
and Wappingers.
Yeah.
So Wappingers is the village?
Oh, I wish it was that straightforward. If it makes you feel any better, they've been doing that sort of stuff since the 18th century. So municipally speaking, and we do have the filings in the county clerk's office to prove this, the town is Wappinger. The village is Wappingers Falls. But on the other hand, the area is referred to as Wappingers Falls from the 18th century onwards, because before all of the damming and whatnot, where the bridge is today was the falls of Wappingers Creek. That's why they built all of the mills there. They just dammed up Wappingers Creek to create the lake to get better water flow. And because 18th century people are probably drunk most of the time, that's what happens when you have, weak beer and weak cider instead of nice, nutritious water. It's like, variable spelling becomes a game. How many different ways can you spell the same name on the same side of a sheet of paper? Or are you just in a hurry and an S creeps in, and you know what, no one cares because it's the 18th century. So that is a time-honored Dutchess County tradition, which I am happy to sustain in my presentation. Any other questions? Yes.
So they put out all they were talking since, and they put up, they said if they didn't show up, there was going to be these fines. Do we have any receipt of the payments to the courts?
So you don't have to pay a fine until you don't show up, and the Mesiers keep showing up. However, for people who don't show up, because that does happen in the 18th century, they're like, sure, I'll show up in court 3 months from now. I definitely will not flee the county. And then they flee the county. Then the sheriff gets involved, because the technical language of that surety promise is that if the condition of showing up in court is not met, then the sheriff is going to come, he's going to look over your house, he's going to go through your stuff, he's going to be like, all right, we need 30 pounds worth of value to pay this. I think all of their earthly belongings are roughly worth 30 pounds. And then they're going to have a sheriff's auction. We still have those things today. They will auction off the materials. They will probably auction off all of the materials that the sheriff took. The sheriff will turn over the surety amount to the court. What happens to the rest is sometimes the subject of even more courtroom drama. Because sometimes that money is turned over to the family, and sometimes the sheriff just decides it's better with him. And it's always fun to see the sheriff as a defendant in a court proceeding. Yeah, there's all sorts of crazy stuff. Any other questions this evening? Maybe one more, yes.
I was just wondering, when did it change that people who went to jail didn't have to pay for their food and bed?
That is a late 19th century change, when suddenly the government started deciding, it would be better if we took better care of people, like everyone. It sort of happens at the same time that we see the state hospital system begin to pop up across New York and a lot of other social services, post-Civil War type thing. And in state facilities, bedding and food and everything else was provided in the state prisons. It's just at the county level, you've got to pay your rent. Well, thank you all so much for being a wonderful audience. Please make sure that you follow that hot tip from Christina and sign up for those, was it Stones and Bones?
Stones and Bones Living History, seeing Wappinger residents come back to life.
We thank Dr. Tatum so very much for joining us again this evening. Thank you. It's wonderful that he can share very local history with us. It's really a wonderful thing that you do for all of the Dutchess County Historical Societies to bring our very local history to life. And we are very fortunate to be able to invite Dr. Tatum, and we hope that you will join us again next year for one of these new discoveries from the ancient documents. Thank you so
Research
much.
is ongoing.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.